In our last lesson, we saw that the English established footholds on the Atlantic seaboard with the establishment of Jamestown in 1607 and the establishment up north of Plymouth in 1620. In fact, by 1733, England had successfully established 13 colonies along the Atlantic seaboard. Now, historians divide these 13 colonies into 3 distinct regions. Each region developed its own unique cultural and political characteristics. These would be New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South. And what we're going to look at today is the establishment of the colonies in New England. And New England established its own unique cultural, political, economic institutions. And this establishment of this colony came as a result of the mass migration of Puritans from southern England to New England and to establish these colonies. So we're going to be looking at these colonies: Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island, and we're going to begin by looking at the colony of Massachusetts. Now, Massachusetts was kind of like the mother colony of the other New England colonies. So the Massachusetts Bay Colony would be the first colony, and the other colonies would be offshoots from that first initial colony. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a result of the creation of a joint stock company, the Massachusetts Bay Company. We've already mentioned joint stock companies. And the Massachusetts Bay Company was founded by a group of Puritans, and in 1629 they received a charter from King Charles I that gave them the right to establish a colony in Massachusetts. Now, King Charles, of course, didn't like Puritans, but he liked money. and that was why he granted the charter. So this group of Puritan investors, one of the most prominent of them was a man by the name of John Winthrop. Now, he was a very educated man from Cambridge, an aristocrat, a lawyer, and he was from the very beginning one of the foremost leaders of the colony. Now, as the Puritans were on a boat getting ready to depart, he gave a very famous speech. And this speech kind of presents us with an idea of the goals and aspirations of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In this speech, he made mention of the new colony as being a city on a hill. And what he was referring to was a passage from the book of Matthew in the New Testament, where Jesus speaks of how Christians should, by their actions and behaviors, be a light to their fellow human beings, to their fellow man. And John Winthrop, he had a vision of the colony of Massachusetts Bay serving as a beacon, as a light, as an example for the people of England to see what a truly Christian community could be. Remember, Puritans wanted to reform the Church of England, the Anglican Church. Now, what the Puritans hoped to do was to create within Massachusetts a Bible commonwealth, like a Bible republic, where, as they said, only Jesus would be king. And they wanted to create a community of what they called visible saints. These would be people who would show by their Christian behavior how a proper Christian community ought to behave. Now, why did they call themselves visible saints? Well, in the Calvinist theology, they believed that God had, before the creation of the world, had predestined or elected, these were the elect of God, had predestined certain people for eternal life. And according to the teaching of predestination, God had determined that some people were predestined for eternal damnation, and others were predestined for eternal salvation, eternal bliss with God. And these elect were the saints of God. Now, the Puritans believed that they could determine through people's action and behavior what people God had predestined for eternal salvation. And they hoped to create a community where everybody could see a community of Christians, a community of saints, the community of elect, all living together and working together in harmony as Christians. Well, they got the charter in 1629, and in 1630, 17 ships assembled and brought the first 1,000 colonists to Massachusetts. And in 1630, one of the first settlements they founded was the town of Boston. Now, over the next 10 years, some 20,000 Puritans would leave their homes mainly in southern England, and come and settle in the Massachusetts Bay area. And this is known as the Great Migration. And you've got to remember, it coincided to a time when Charles I, who was the enemy of the Puritans, had his period of personal rule. Now, when the Puritans settled New England, what they typically did was to establish settlements based on church congregations. Remember, in the Calvinist Puritan church, every congregation of Christians was separate and independent. And these congregations were made up of freemen. These would be the adult male heads of households. And under the leadership of a minister, what they would do is they would go out into the wilderness, and the first thing they would do was to establish a meeting place, a church, a meeting hall where they could come together for worship and for meetings. And that would be where they would have their church services, but also where they would organize themselves and talk about issues affecting the community. But also, they would divide up the land equally among all male heads of household. So every member got his own piece of property to farm. Well, originally, when the colony was founded, the government of the colony was determined by the stockholders. The stockholders alone elected the governor and the advisory council to the governor. But you see, now that all these Puritans had settled in New England and had acquired land, many of the Puritans did not think that it was proper, that they had no voice, that they had no vote. Remember, it was the English tradition, if you owned land, you could vote. So when the government of the council tried to impose taxes without getting any kind of consent from the people, there was a lot of protests, and eventually the company relented and decided that the governor and the council would be directly elected by all adult freemen, all adult male heads of household who owned property and who were members of the church. And then in 1634 they decided to elect a colonial legislature called a general court. What happened was that members of the community of every town would meet in their meeting hall and elect delegates to the general court. Now, from 1644 onward, you had a situation where the general court was elected by the people, the freeholders, and then the general court would elect the council that would advise the governor. And so basically what the Puritans had done was to mimic the structure of Parliament. So you had an upper house, the council, and a lower house, the general court, just like you had in England, the House of Lords and the House of Commons. Now, for a long period of time, the Puritans enjoyed a great deal of autonomy and independence, primarily because England was going through the English Civil War and had its own problems. But things began to change with the Restoration. Remember, Charles II was restored to the throne, and he didn't like Puritans. Remember, the Puritans had executed his father in 1649. So Charles II was determined to redo the colony, and to revoke its initial charter. And so he sent investigators and brought it to the English courts, and it was determined that the original charter of 1629 was invalid because the Puritans were not paying taxes, weren't paying customs duties, and were not allowing the establishment of Anglican churches within their territory. So that was the end of the charter. Now, right after that happened in 1685, Charles I passed on. He had no children of his own, so the throne passed to his younger brother, James II. Now, James II, he had big plans. And his plan was this. He already controlled, as we'll see, New York. So he wanted to expand his control to include all of New England. And his plan was to create what he would call a Dominion of New England. And where there would be no representative government whatsoever. He wasn't a big fan, like his father, he wasn't a big fan of representative government. So he appointed a governor who answered only to him. And the governor that he appointed was a friend of his by the name of James Andros, who happened to be Roman Catholic. So it was James II was Roman Catholic as well. Now, James Andros attempted to rule by decree. He didn't ask for the consent of the general court. He didn't summon the general court. He ordered the general court to be disbanded. And when Puritan leaders criticized the new governor, he had them put in jail. He had them imprisoned. So it looked like the Puritans were in deep trouble. But things happened, though. In 16 In 1688, you had an event known in English history as the Glorious Revolution. You see, James II, it turns out, was very unpopular among the English as well. And he was Roman Catholic. And that made him kind of unacceptable to the largely Protestant English population. So in 1688, Parliament deposed James II, and they asked his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange from the Netherlands to come over and be the new king and queen of England. Mary and William and Mary were brought over, and they assumed the throne as king and queen. And this all happened without bloodshed at the time. And it's called the Glorious Revolution because Parliament asserted itself and established it as the sovereign force in the government of the colony. Now, when these things were happening in England, in 1689, the Puritans took it upon themselves to actually arrest Andros in the name of the new king and queen. And eventually, in 1691, King William and Mary issued a new charter that created the royal colony of Massachusetts, where the governor was appointed by the crown, but the Puritans retained the right to elect, all freemen anyway, could elect the general court, the colonial legislature. Now, one legacy of this glorious revolution as it occurred in Massachusetts was that, from the perspective of the colonists, what they believed was that they had a right to elect a colonial legislature. That was their fundamental right. And when Andros had attempted to disband the general court, he had been squashed, he had been arrested, and so this established a strong tradition in the colonies of autonomy and representative government. All right, so what we're going to do now is talk about the next colony. We've talked about Massachusetts. Let's talk about Connecticut. Now, Connecticut was founded by colonists from Massachusetts. A group of Massachusetts Bay colonists established 3 towns along the Connecticut River, the towns of Windsor, Hartford, and Wethersfield. Now, when they established themselves in the Connecticut River Valley, they soon found themselves at odds with the Pequots, who were the most powerful tribe in the Connecticut River Valley. And as a result of the war that broke out, the colonists in the Connecticut River Valley, they asked the Massachusetts Bay Colony if they could organize their own government so they'd be in a better position to organize themselves to defend themselves from the Pequots. And what they did was to draw up their own new constitution. It's called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. And it called for a system where the governor was elected by all freemen, all adult males who own property, and it also called for the general court or a representative legislature to represent the people of Connecticut. Now, around the same time that the communities were established along the Connecticut River, another group of Puritans left Massachusetts, and they were led by a man by the name of John Davenport. And these were Massachusetts Puritans who felt that the Massachusetts Bay Colony wasn't pure enough. And so they left Massachusetts and they established a colony at New Haven. And this colony was very, very strict. I mean, alcohol, any kind of drunkenness was punished with harsh fines. I mean, it was against the law even to play cards. I mean, they had very strict rules about they wanted a community of true Christians, and they had very strict rules about how the colony ought to be governed. Now, we jump ahead to the Restoration and Charles II coming to power. And Charles II, he didn't like, especially New Haven. It turns out that some of the people who had been on the jury that had condemned his father to death, some of them had found refuge in New Haven and were living in Connecticut. So he was out to get him. So what he decided to do was to, in 1662, he issued a new royal charter. And basically, the New Haven colony was absorbed into the Connecticut River towns, and this created a colony of Connecticut. Now, he did allow the colonists of Connecticut to elect their own governor. And so that's why Connecticut became known as a corporate colony, because the corporation of citizens were the ones who elected the governor, not it wasn't appointed by the crown. All right, so let's talk about New Hampshire next. New Hampshire. Now, in the case of New Hampshire, what had happened, a little background for that, is that back in 1620, James I of England, he had taken away from the Virginia Company all the land north of the Chesapeake River. And he had established his own council to govern this region called the Council of New England. And what he began to do was to hand out land to members of his court. These were people who were supporters of the king, aristocrats, and he made them proprietors. And a proprietor would be someone who would be responsible for governing the colony, the new area, but also would collect rents and taxes from the region as well. Now, in the case of what would become future New Hampshire, much of the land was given to a man, a friend of the king by the name of John Mason. Now, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded in 1630, though, a lot of colonists from Massachusetts Bay went up north and settled in New Hampshire, settled in this land. And that's the way the situation was for a number of years. Till, of course, comes the Restoration in 1660. Now, with the Restoration in 1660, some of the descendants of John Mason were thinking that this land should belong to them. You see, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had gone ahead and just formally taken over this territory in 1642. But the descendants of John Mason said, no, you can't do that. That colony belongs to us by virtue of the land grant that was made to our ancestor, John Mason. So this created a court battle, a legal battle between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and the descendants of John Mason. And of course, the king was biased in favor of the descendants of John Mason. And eventually, to resolve the dispute, what happened was New Hampshire was taken away from Massachusetts and created as a royal colony. So the Royal Colony of New Hampshire, created in 1679. And it was allowed to have its own colonial legislature. But the fact of the matter was is that throughout much of the history of the colonial New England, the royal governor of New Hampshire was often the same person who was the royal governor of Massachusetts. You had the same governor governing both royal colonies. All right, the last and very distinct New England colony we're going to talk about is Rhode Island. Now, Rhode Island was very different because it was the only colony in New England that did not have an established church. Remember, the Massachusetts Bay, when it was founded, you had to be a member of the church to vote and to hold office, and no other churches were allowed. I mean, the established church was the Calvinist Congregational Church. Now, Roger Williams was a Cambridge-trained minister, and he was also a Puritan. He arrived in Massachusetts in 1631, and he did not like this idea of there being an established church. He didn't like the idea that voting required church membership. He thought that such a situation would invite hypocrisy, that people would join the church for political gain or material gain rather than out of a sincere spiritual desire. He was a purist, in other words, a purist of the pure. He also he disagreed with the idea that land could be taken from Indians. He thought that the Indians had title to the land and that any kind of land settlement had to be in agreement with the Indians. Now, he was expelled from Massachusetts. You know, if he spoke out against the leaders that be, and eventually he was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he went to be a missionary. He went to preach to the Narragansett Indians. And in 1636, and after he preached for a couple of years to them, he worked out a deal with these Indians, and he purchased land. And he founded a new city, a new town that was called Providence. Now, when he established the town, he established a town there would be no established church. In other words, you could join a church or not join a church, whatever you wanted. And as a result, Rhode Island became a refuge for a lot of people who were unhappy with the situation in Massachusetts. So Quakers came and settled in Rhode Island. Baptists came and settled in Rhode Island. In fact, the first Baptist church in America was established in Providence, Rhode Island, in Rhode Island. And another thing about Rhode Island was that a lot of folks who weren't very religious, who didn't want to belong to church, went there as well. In fact, critics of Rhode Island refer to it as Rogues Island because of the people there were not all up to snuff in their spiritual lives. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had threatened to kick out Roger Williams and to force him out. So what he did is he went to England, met with leaders of Parliament in 1644, and he secured a patent. And so from this point onward, the colony became known as Providence Plantations. And he set up a system where the governor was elected, and you had a general court elected by the people who lived in Rhode Island. Now, in 1663, with the Restoration in place, Roger Williams knew that his patent from Parliament might be questioned because Parliament had made the patent, not the king. So in 1663, he went to the king. He went to King Charles II and asked that his colony be recognized officially by a royal charter, and he received it. In 1663, King Charles II granted Rhode Island a charter that allowed Rhode Island to become the second corporate colony, where the colonists were elected by, where the governor was elected by the colonists. And a lot of people, historians would say that he made the grant because he just wanted to annoy Puritans. So we've seen how the New England colonies were established in the 17th century. The next thing we're going to look at is how New England developed culturally as a society, and that will be the focus of our next lesson.